It is 2009. Malaysia stands on the edge of something big. A rebranding, a reinvention, a chance to prove to the world that it is no longer a developing nation, but a future powerhouse. And in the heart of that ambition lies a fund that was supposed to change everything. A national fund designed to help the people. A mysterious young man with impossible connections. Billions that vanish. A global manhunt that spans New York, Abu Dhabi, Singapore, and Hollywood. And in the middle of the chaos, a single question. How does a 28-year-old graduate become the architect of the biggest financial heist the world has ever seen? This is the story of 1MDB and Jho Low, the invisible billionaire who fooled prime ministers, global banks, and Wall Street itself. It all started with an idea. The idea was simple, almost noble. Malaysia needed investment. Malaysia needed growth. Malaysia needed something that could fuel its vision of a modern, wealthy nation. Enter 1MDB, One Malaysia Development Berhad, a sovereign wealth fund built to attract foreign investment, boost economic development, and support the Malaysian people. On paper, it looked perfect, a shining symbol of hope, a way for Malaysia to join the club of nations with powerful state funds like Norway, Abu Dhabi, Qatar. But here's the twist. Unlike Norway, whose fund was built on decades of oil wealth, Malaysia didn't have that kind of money. So 1MDB would have to borrow. And borrow. And borrow. But no one predicted that the fund, meant to support a nation, would become the weapon used to rob it. No one, except one man. At the time, no one paid much attention to him. Why would they? He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a banker. He wasn't a business magnate. He was just Low Taik Jho, or more popularly known as Jho Low, a soft-spoken Malaysian man in oversized spectacles with a round face and a habit of blending into the background. A man who by all outward appearances looked like a minor advisor at best, a consultant, a fixer, a go-between. But behind that mild, forgettable exterior was something else entirely. A mind engineered for manipulation, a talent for invisibility, a genius for spending money that wasn't his. And most importantly, a web of connections that stretched from Middle Eastern royalty to Hollywood producers. New York City, a penthouse party, champagne towers, Rihanna performing for a private crowd, Paris Hilton lounging beside Jho Low as he sprays a bottle of Armand de Brignot like confetti. People looked at him and wondered, who is this guy? No one knew. No one asked. No one cared. Because in the world Jho Low operated in, money didn't talk. It screamed. And he had access to more of it than anyone imagined. While Jho Low partied across the world, 1MDB began raising money at a pace that made financial analysts uneasy. Billions, not millions, billions, raised within months. But the deals made no sense. The investments were vague. The structure was complex. The partnerships were questionable. Yet somehow, everything was approved. Why? Because the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak, was the chairman of the fund. And Jho Low? He made sure to be very, very close. The public saw 1MDB as a national treasure, The elite saw it as an opportunity, but Jho Low saw it differently. A bottomless wallet, a global piggy bank, a game with no rules. And as the money flowed, he began building an empire of yachts, luxury homes, art, jewelry, private jets, and influence. Behind the scenes, global banks started noticing strange transactions, unusual partners, shell companies, large cash movements with no clear purpose. But no one wanted to challenge Malaysia's sovereign wealth fund. Too risky, too political, too profitable. And that silence allowed the first wave of the heist to unfold flawlessly. To understand how one MDB was drained, imagine a maze built inside another maze wrapped in smoke and mirrors. Jho Low's method was elegant in its simplicity. 1. Set up fake companies that resembled real ones. 2. Use one MDB to send money to these companies under the guise of strategic partnerships. 3. Move that money through offshore accounts in banks that ask no questions. 4. Spend it. Lavishly, outrageously, without restraint. Some of the money went into real estate, penthouses in New York, mansions in Beverly Hills, apartments in London. Some went into art, Monet, Basquiat, Rothko. And some simply vanished into the shadows of offshore banking. But here's the irony. While Jho Low was funding movies about scammers, he was running the biggest scam of all. Billions were gone, vanished, evaporated. And Malaysia? It had no idea. Not yet. But the moment the truth began to leak, the world changed.
This is how every good expose begins. A whisper, a rumor, a number that doesn't add up. The first cracks appeared when an investigative journalist started asking, how does a sovereign wealth fund lose money this fast? How was a 28-year-old consultant flying around on private jets with Leonardo DiCaprio? How did one MDB issue billions in bonds without clear accountability? At first, the stories were ignored, pushed aside, buried under political influence. But the smoke kept rising, and eventually, people began to realize, where there is smoke, there is a fire. And this fire was about to engulf global banks, Hollywood celebrities, Middle Eastern investors, and the Malaysian Prime Minister himself. By now, Jho Low's spending was becoming legendary. By now, journalists were circling. By now, the U.S. Department of Justice was gathering intel. By now, bankers across Switzerland, Singapore, and Luxembourg were panicking. And quietly, secretly, FBI agents had begun tracking Jho Low's financial fingerprints across the world. Airplane logs, wire transfers, hotel records, art auctions, casino transactions, confidential embassy communications. They were building a case, a massive one that would expose the biggest financial scandal in modern history. And as the net began to close, Jho Low did something unexpected, something shocking, something that would send the investigation spiraling into chaos and reveal just how deep the corruption went. Because Jho Low did not run, he did not hide, he did not lay low. Instead, he prepared for war. Before the tabloids called him the Asian Gatsby, before the FBI plastered his name across financial crime warrants, Jho Low was a ghost. Not a politician, not a minister, not even an official employee of one MDB. Yet, somehow he was everywhere. He moved around Kuala Lumpur at first like a harmless rich kid, a chubby-faced 28-year-old who wore spectacles, smiled politely, and blended so well into the background that you could bump into him twice and still forget who he was. But behind that modest exterior lived a mind obsessed with power, influence, and perception. Jho Low understood something most people never do. The world rarely questions the man who acts like he belongs. He was about to prove it on a global stage. While Najib Razak took the political credit from Malaysia's new sovereign wealth fund, Jho Low was quietly stitching together the most important relationships behind the scenes. He met princes in the Middle East. He courted bankers in Switzerland. He charmed Hollywood executives like he was born in Beverly Hills. People who crossed paths with him later said he had an unnerving gift. He knew exactly what you wanted, and he knew how to give it to you in a way that tied a string around your neck. Every deal was a favor. Every introduction was a debt. Every partnership was a hook. Soon, Jho Low was advising one MDB informally, then privately, then secretly. And before anyone knew it, he wasn't just advising, he was directing the flow of billions of dollars. But the best trick? His name appeared on no paperwork, no public records, no official leadership position. Yet, he was the most powerful man in one MDB, and technically, he didn't even work there. When Hollywood met Jho Low, they didn't see a mastermind. They saw a billionaire prankster, a party king who spent money like it was oxygen, and he needed to breathe. Private jets, penthouse suites, tables packed with champagne bottles so expensive the labels glowed gold. A rotating cast of celebrities from Leonardo DiCaprio to Paris Hilton, orbiting him like he was a planet of wealth. Clubs across New York and Las Vegas whispered his name. Joe's coming tonight. Clear the best tables. Bring out the fireworks. At one point, he spent over $2 million on alcohol in a single night. That wasn't partying. That was laundering reputation. Because while the world saw an eccentric spender, no one asked where the money came from. It was cover, all of it. Noise, chaos, a smokescreen of decadence. While he threw million-dollar parties, billions were quietly moving through offshore accounts. Every empire needs architects. Jho Low needed bankers who could turn dirty ambition into clean transactions. Enter Goldman Sachs, specifically a Malaysian-born banker named Tim Lesner and his associate, the aggressive, hard-charging Roger N. They didn't just open the doors to global finance, they removed them. Jho Low promised Goldman Sachs astronomical fees, the kind no banker says no to. And Goldman Sachs delivered. 3 massive bond deals at breakneck speed with almost no due diligence. Total value? $6.5 billion. Total profit to Goldman? Roughly $600 million. That kind of money doesn't just raise eyebrows, it breaks them clean off. But no one raised eyebrows, let alone stop it. The deals were too juicy. The politics were too delicate. The machine was moving too fast. And deep inside the machinery was Jho Low's hand. Jho Low's strategy, which investigators would later call one of the most sophisticated financial crimes in modern history, worked like this. Step 1, create a legitimate government fund. Step 2, issue massive bonds with global banks. Step 3, funnel the money into shell companies that look real but aren't. One by one, the billions flowed into offshore entities with confusing names. Good Star Limited, Abar Investments PJS Limited, Tannery Finance Corporation. Companies that on paper look like subsidiaries of legitimate organizations, but in reality were just Jho Low's personal vacuum cleaners. Money meant to develop Malaysia was buying penthouses in New York, paintings by Monet, and jewelry for models on yachts. It was the perfect heist. Quiet, complex, and hidden behind layers of financial fog. Until, of course, the fog started clearing. By 2013, whispers were circulating through Wall Street. Who was this Jho Low? Why did he have access to so much cash? Why did one MDB keep losing money while Jho kept buying assets across the world? A journalist would later describe him perfectly. He didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like someone playing a billionaire. Because billionaires don't flaunt everything. Pretenders do. And Jho Low flaunted so loudly that eventually someone listened. Banks began asking questions. Regulators began sniffing around. Journalists began digging through filings. And inside one MDB, employees noticed something strange. Massive transfers leaving the fund, heading to offshore entities no one recognized. Some tried to ask questions. They were shut down, or transferred, or threatened gently, then aggressively. Still, the cracks were forming. Still, the truth was pushing up through the soil like buried bones. But Jho Low didn't slow down. He pushed harder because he understood something others didn't. Once a machine built on momentum stops, it collapses. Late one night in 2013, a compliance officer at a major international bank flagged a transfer from an account linked to 1MDB. A huge transfer. Suspicious. Poorly documented. Linked to a shell company in the British Virgin Islands. She sent it up the chain. Hours later, she received a quiet phone call from a senior figure. Let it go. Process it. Her blood ran cold. Why? Why would a bank override its own compliance red flags for a fund few people had ever heard of? She noted the incident privately, saved the file, kept the emails. She didn't know it yet, but that single transfer would later become one of the smoking guns in the FBI investigation. And in that moment, the world didn't know it yet, but the tide had begun to turn. Because you can bury money. You can bury paperwork. You can bury the truth. But you can't bury everyone. Not forever. The machine is overheating. The money is moving faster. And regulators, journalists, and investigators are starting to smell smoke.
The heist explodes onto the world stage. The scandals spill into Hollywood. And Jho Low's fantasy life begins to collapse under its own weight. If money is the most powerful force in the world, then Jho Low had found a way to bend gravity itself. He didn't need armies. He didn't need a cabinet seat. He didn't even need to be seen. All he needed was a phone, a smile, and a network of bankers too greedy to ask questions. And once the 1MDB pipeline opened, the world didn't just change, it tilted. When 1MDB transferred its first strategic partnership investment, a staggering $1 billion, to a mysterious company called Petro Saudi International, there were raised eyebrows. But in Malaysia, everything looked clean. Politicians smiled. Newspapers praised the visionary foreign partnership. Behind the curtain, though, the money took a sharp left turn. Instead of going into Petro Saudi's official accounts, huge chunks flowed into an entity called Goodstar Limited, a company secretly controlled by Jho Low. Not the board, not the sovereign fund executives, not the auditors. Only him. And the moment the money touched Goodstar's account, Jho Low vanished. Not physically, socially. He went off the books, becoming a whisper in the corridors of Swiss banks, a rumor among Middle Eastern fund managers, and a horror story in compliance departments. Nobody could confirm his role. Nobody dared accuse him. Because somehow,
Jho Low knew exactly how to make people hold their tongues. He turned invisibility into a lifestyle. He was everywhere and nowhere. Picture this, a conference room in Switzerland, glass walls, the Alps glowing outside like a postcard. Inside, two senior HSBC private bankers in pristine suits. And across from them, a young Malaysian man in a t-shirt, sneakers, and a grin. Jho Low. He did not look like someone about to move hundreds of millions across borders. But when he placed his phone on the table and said, "I represent high-level sovereign interest," the bankers leaned forward. He had charm, he had confidence, and he had government signatures, or at least cleverly crafted documents that looked like government signatures. What banker would argue? Money softened everybody, and Jho was about to flood their vaults. Within months, multi-million-dollar transactions zipped through offshore companies. Compliance officers waved things through because this is sovereign wealth. Internal warnings were buried. Senior bankers approved deals that violated every rule they had sworn to uphold. It was a bank heist without guns, a theft without breaking locks, a robbery committed with handshakes. Jho Low had cracked the code. If you spend money fast enough, no one can stop you. If you spend money everywhere, no one can trace you. If you spend money loudly, people assume you're legitimate. And he spent louder than anyone alive. When Jho Low walked into Hollywood, the room changed. Producers whispered, actresses smiled, executives became eager children, because a new billionaire had arrived, with no limit, no oversight, and no financial gravity. He financed champagne-soaked parties in New York and Vegas. He flew celebrities on private jets just for dinner. He rented yachts bigger than football fields. And then he made his biggest move. He became the financial engine behind The Wolf of Wall Street. Yes, the movie about financial fraud was funded with money laundered from a sovereign wealth fund stolen from a nation. The irony was so perfect, even the FBI later admitted it was painful. To Hollywood, Jho was a mystery billionaire, a unicorn, a benefactor, a dream. To 1MDB investigators, he was the center of a spiderweb. But while Hollywood celebrated him, another storm was brewing. Because every dollar Jho spent to impress the world was a dollar missing from Malaysia's schools, roads, hospitals, and future. And someone was beginning to ask questions. Some stories begin with a crash. This one began with a folder. A small, unmarked folder placed anonymously at the doorstep of a journalist in Kuala Lumpur. Inside, account statements, wire transfers, shell company charts, and a note that simply read, "Follow this. It all starts with Good Star." The journalist froze. This was dynamite, a career-making story, a nation-shaking revelation. But it was also the kind of story that got people killed. He contacted international networks. He sent encrypted messages. He reached out to reporters abroad. Because the numbers didn't just prove corruption, they proved something worse. 1MDB wasn't losing money. It was being robbed. Systematically, deliberately, globally. And every trail led back to one name. He wrote it on top of the file. Jho Low. When the journalist's first article hit the presses, nothing happened. For 12 hours. Then, the world exploded. International regulators opened emergency reviews. Swiss authorities froze accounts. Singaporean banks launched panic audits. Wall Street lawyers started whispering the words, money laundering. And at the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C., a red flag lit up a desk in the FBI's International Corruption Unit. The file landed in front of an agent who read through it once, twice, then whispered, "Jesus Christ, this is global." The FBI opened a full-scale investigation. They traced the funds, they subpoenaed bankers, they tore through offshore records, they contacted Hollywood. And something shocking became clear. Jho Low had stolen so much money that American banks had unknowingly laundered Malaysian public funds into U.S. real estate, movies, casinos, and yachts. This was no longer about Malaysia. This was international crime. And the FBI does not sleep on international crime. As agencies around the world began closing in, as banks grew nervous, as journalists sharpened their pens, Jho Low did something nobody expected. He made one final transfer. A transfer so large, so sudden, so reckless, that investigators later described it as panic in financial form. Hundreds of millions left one country, jumped through shell companies like stepping stones, and landed in a secret jurisdiction with no extradition treaties. By the time authorities arrived at his known residences, his penthouse was empty. His yacht was gone. His phone numbers were dead. His staff had been dismissed. His friends claimed they hadn't heard from him. It was as if he had melted into the air. Jho Low didn't run. He evaporated. And when the FBI tried to trace him, all they found were shadows. And one question echoed across the investigation rooms of 3 continents. If Jho Low stole billions without firing a shot, without leaving fingerprints, without ever holding public office, what else was he capable of? The funny thing about global scandals is that for a long time, they look invisible. Nobody sees the cracks until one stray detail refuses to stay buried. And in the 1MDB story, that detail surfaced in New York, thousands of kilometers away from the golden towers of Kuala Lumpur. Because every heist, no matter how sophisticated, eventually leaves fingerprints. And Jho Low, for all his clever disguises, left a whole trail of them. It started with something small. A compliance analyst at a major U.S. bank was reviewing a series of wire transfers linked to a shell company in the British Virgin Islands. At first glance, it looked normal, routine even, but the amounts raised eyebrows. 10 million here, 30 million there, and a strange pattern. Funds hopping through offshore entities that had no clear business activity. The analyst did what professionals do in such situations. He filed a suspicious activity report. That one report didn't expose the scheme, but it joined dozens of others submitted by different banks in different countries. And slowly, the financial crimes network in the US began to piece together a shadowy movement of money. At the center of most flows was a name that kept showing up like a ghost: Jho Low. Not a Malaysian official, not a government minister, not even a board member of 1MDB, just an advisor, or so he claimed. But why was he moving hundreds of millions? The FBI wanted answers. While American investigators started sniffing around, Hollywood was busy enjoying the aftermath of Jho's golden era. The Wolf of Wall Street had just been released. The champagne-soaked premieres were over. The gossip columns had moved on. But some people remembered the strange Malaysian man who wrote massive checks with suspicious ease. A few producers began whispering that the money seemed too good to be true.
Meanwhile, rumors reached Leonardo DiCaprio himself. Someone close to the production quietly warned him, "Bro, this financing might not be clean." Leo panicked. The FBI approached him politely but firmly, asking questions about gifts received, the Oscar statue, the paintings, the yacht trips. To his credit, he cooperated fully. But the Hollywood connection made one thing clear. 1MDB wasn't an exotic local fraud. It was a global crime scene. Back in Malaysia, storm clouds were gathering. Najib Razak still denied every accusation. He insisted 1MDB was fine, that foreign enemies were attacking Malaysia, that critics were traitors. Government-controlled newspapers backed him, loyalists defended him, his political machine worked overtime. But the documents leaked by The Edge and Sarawak Report kept spreading like wildfire. And then, Malaysia's former prime minister and political giant, Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, came out of retirement and openly accused Najib of corruption. The nation gasped. This wasn't a small-time opposition figure. This was a man who once ruled for 22 years. When Mahathir speaks, Malaysia listens. Within months, the country turned into a political battleground. Civil servants whispered in office corridors, young voters marched in yellow bear-sea protests, even rural voters, long loyal to Najib, began to question why billions intended to improve their futures ended up in Hollywood, Las Vegas, and Monaco. Najib tried to silence critics. Activists were arrested, journalists were threatened, banking officers who knew too much were quietly transferred. But one thing he could not control was the truth leaking across borders. The FBI, the DOJ, the Swiss Attorney General, the Singaporean regulators, they were all circling, and they were closing in fast. Jho Low's super yacht, Equanimity, became a symbol of the scandal. Every inch of that vessel screamed excess. The gold-plated fixtures, the cinema room, the spa, the helicopter pad. It wasn't just wealth. It was a floating monument to stolen dreams. Authorities tracked it for months. Jho kept moving it across different jurisdictions trying to outrun seizures. But like all fugitives, they made mistakes. One day, while docked off Bali, Indonesian police, working closely with the FBI, surrounded the yacht. Tourists watched in disbelief as heavily armed officers stormed a vessel worth $250 million. Within 24 hours, Equanimity was seized. It was the first major public crack in Jho Low's armor, and it sent shockwaves across global financial circles. If the yacht was seized, what came next? Banks panicked. Wealth managers panic. Hollywood panic. Even those who barely knew Jho Low began calling their lawyers. While investigators hunted Jho Low, the rest of the 1MDB ecosystem began to collapse. Swiss banks were fined heavily. Singapore shut down entire financial institutions. Compliance departments worldwide went into overdrive, terrified that their names would appear in the next investigative report. Some bankers resigned quietly. Others were fired loudly. A few were arrested. One Swiss banker even claimed he was misled by Jho Low, describing him as one of the most persuasive individuals he had ever encountered. But no excuse could erase the fact that global financial institutions had helped launder public money. Billions that should have built schools, hospitals, roads, broadband networks, and housing in Malaysia had instead funded Hollywood films, Las Vegas gambling sprees, insane private jets, jewels worth more than small islands, and champagne bills so high they made nightclub owners weep with joy.
While the scandal thrilled journalists and fascinated Hollywood, the real victims were the Malaysian people. Entire development projects were stalled. Billions intended for infrastructure never materialized. Young Malaysians carried the burden of public debt tied to a fund that had been emptied. The tragedy was national, the humiliation was global, and the lesson was painfully clear. When corruption wears a designer suit, it can fool the world for years. But perhaps the most important lesson came from the aftermath. For the first time, Malaysia demonstrated that even the most powerful could fall, that even those who controlled the media, the institutions, the narratives could be brought down by truth. Today, Jho Low remains one of the world's most infamous fugitives, a billionaire without a country, a ghost with luxury tastes, a man who rewrote the playbook on international fraud. He destroyed a sovereign wealth fund, toppled a government, embarrassed global banks, and fooled Hollywood. His story isn't just a heist, it's a warning. A reminder that greed, when paired with intelligence and opportunity, can create monsters no one sees until it's too late. And somewhere out there, behind private walls and encrypted phone lines, the man who once lit up Vegas and Monte Carlo may still be smiling, because he pulled off the kind of crime people write movies about. And he got away. For now. If you enjoyed this story, please click the subscribe button and stick around for more interesting true crime stories that educate and entertain.